All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I know there's still going to be some folks joining us, but thank you all for joining our second biomass financing webinar focused on productization, commodity to brand. My name is Sam Bayless. I'm a senior project manager at Valley Vision. Valley Vision is the regional convener for the We Prosper Together initiative, which is the California Jobs First capital region group. So the We Prosper Together initiative, as well as the California Jobs First initiative, is really focused, is coming from the California Governor's Office, really focused on a few things, which is creating high-paying, good, high-quality jobs for people in the greater Sacramento capital region, which is an eight-county region around the Sacramento region. But so yeah, we're focused on the high quality jobs with a lens for equity and climate. And over the past few years, in working with the community, working with local industries and business, and working with local jurisdictions all around that eight county region, biomass really came to the forefront as something of great interest that would hit all three of those priorities for our group. And we brought on Lindsey Nitta to help us really bring folks together using her expertise and contacts in the region to help produce things like this webinar series, as well as a lot of work over the last few years to really get out there in a grassroots way. To identify opportunities, identify support strategies, and other things that are needed in the region to support the biomass economy. Um, And really, I'll go ahead and let Lindsay take it away, but we really thank you all for joining. We really do think that addressing whether it's agricultural biomass or woody biomass in our forests is really a way to avoid emissions, whether it's wildfire or pile burning, but really trying to find out what the new economy is of this region and increase those opportunities, whether it's in biomass to energy, wood products, or other interesting products that would be able to or increase sustainability in our region. And I will go ahead and hand it over to Lindsay.
Great. Thanks so much, Sam. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Really excited for this conversation. I just wanted to say appreciate everyone's feedback from the first webinar, which was on cost and concepting of biomass projects. It's on YouTube, so if you missed it, you can revisit it there, and we'll also post the resources and the actual webinar to YouTube of this one as well. So yeah, and there's anything else that we can provide, please let us know. But we're incorporating your feedback as we move forward. And one of them is which is to hear directly from somebody that's has developed a project in our region and was really excited to connect with Greg Ray. He is the co-founder and CTO of Carbon Zero, a biochar project that's happening in Colusa. And I'll let Greg introduce himself and his project. But thank you so much, Greg, for joining us.
Oh, thanks, Lindsay. Thanks, Sam, and thanks for everyone for having me here. I guess let me just start off to tell you a little bit about us, Carbon Zero, and the project. So we started it in 2024. It was me and my business partner, his daughter. It was actually his daughter's idea to want to do something in the environmental space, and that got us thinking about, okay, well, what does the market look like for carbon credits? We started investigating that, started looking at nature-based, enhanced rock weathering, and then we finally looked at biochar, and just purely from a economic standpoint, we felt that biochar had the most scalable potential. And specifically, what I mean by that is I'd say 90% of all the durable carbon credits that have been retired were from biochar. So that's sort of what got us looking at that space. And so we actually came from Silicon Valley. We were software and hardware engineers, and we really didn't have any idea of what we were getting into with biomass when we jumped into this. Originally, when we first started sort of brainstorming this and thinking about it on paper, it felt a little bit more like a solar panel array where you plug it in and it just sort of runs itself and generate carbon credits on the back end, and everything's great. But in reality is it's far, far more complex than that. And there's so many pitfalls and sort of nightmare scenarios that we've been through. And I'm happy to discuss all of that today in full transparency and be as helpful as possible for folks that are looking to enter this space. Really, really just try to take advantage of my time here, and when we get to Q&A, just ask anything and I will do my best to answer it. So I'm going to jump in to some slides and just show our facility first of all. I'm going to share. All right. Lindsey, can you see my screen? All right, perfect. So this is a layout of our facility that we've built. I'm going to kind of go back and forth between this and just showing some pictures as well as we walk through it, so you can kind of get an idea of what our process is like. So first of all, we've co-located with a almond processor in Colusa County. So we've partnered with Cortina Hulling and Shelling. They're up in Williams, and we take all of their almond shell that they have no use for and there's no market for, and we turn it into biochar. So we're actually located in the back half of their property. And if I wish I had a picture of it to show you, but there's just giant mountains of almond shell, and they are such a pain in the butt to deal with. And I had no idea before getting into this that these things would just catch fire if you don't do anything. And so we've had to develop pretty sophisticated SOPs around keeping them from catching fire, including tarping them, rejecting any shell if it's been rained on, preventing wet shell from being mixed with the dry shell, because all of those things will end up starting the anaerobic digestion process underneath the big piles of the shell, and that creates heat, and that heat will eventually reach 100 200 degrees Celsius, and then it will catch fire. So what we do is we have a front loader, and the front loader loads shell from big piles of almond shell that we have over here into this hopper. And this hopper, let me flip back to here. Looks like, well, this is what our facility looks like. This is the hopper. I'll show you another picture of the hopper. So it's a very large hopper. It's about 12 hours of supply. One of the things that we wanted to do is make sure we didn't have to have a full-time person constantly loading shell into the facility. And so we developed this hopper on our own. It's got air cannons to prevent bridging, and then we can load it when it's not raining, and we can cover it when it is raining, so we can keep the moisture out of it. Then the shell falls into this trommel screen. This trommel screen looks like this. This just shakes off all the dust. Our system doesn't do well with dust. Specifically, it will clog up a lot of our burners. And so we go out of our way to try to remove as much of the dust as possible. And one of the sort of hard-learned lessons when we did this project is we found out after we had purchased all of the offtake for the next 10 years of this almond shell, that their facility, all of the shell gets picked up at the same time for the dust for the entire facility. So we end up getting and paying for all of the dust in the that comes to us from our partner. And I guess the lesson there is when you're doing your feedstock agreements, you want to carve out moisture and make sure that the feedstock quality is exactly what you want. And so if I could go back and do it again, I'd say like, hey, we're not really interested in paying you for your dust that we can't use. And we're not interested in paying for the rained on shell, because right now the way the contract's set up is that we still have to buy it. I mean, we are contractually obligated to buy all of their shell, whether they let it get rained on for 3 weeks or not. And if it was rained on, it has to go to compost. It can't mix it with our dry shell. You can't run it through our process. The process has a 15% moisture cap on it. And so it has to go to compost, and then we're paying to get it composted at that point. And so now we just paid our partner to buy the shell that we immediately have to turn around and pay for the trucking to get it to a compost yard. So it's a double cost, and it's just it sucks. So when you're signing your contracts, like just make sure that you're buying the right feedstock, which is the feedstock that you actually need for your facility, for your process. Then it goes into up here, it drops into an airlock. That's right here in this process. So all of the shell drops into an airlock. And the reason is that we have a low oxygen environment. We don't actually want to combust our feedstock, we want to pyrolyze it. And so it all goes through an airlock, and that keeps the oxygen out from the actual chamber that's doing the pyrolysis. And that's this. And so there's an inner chamber and an outer chamber. So it drops into an inner chamber, and this is a rotary drum kiln. And so if you imagine inside of it, there's just some fins, and these fins push it along. So the fins push it along this way, and then it drops into an outer shell, and then the fins push it along back out this way. And then finally, the finished biochar comes out here. It gets cooled and quenched and then dropped. So that's pretty much how biochar is made. And then the rest of it, which is 90% of the work, is all about syngas management. So everything, like making the biochar is the easy part. And then the hard part is how do you manage the syngas that's being created, because the syngas is flammable. It can corrode. It has to be the right mixture, has to go in. It can you can overload your system and create too much syngas, and then it'll increase the temperature of your kiln, and then that creates a runaway. And so there's all kinds of things that you have to worry about with syngas. But we have a pretty sophisticated system now for managing our syngas and making sure that the correct amount of syngas is being fed in and being able to automatically shut off in the event that it's getting too high temperature. So what you see here is we have combustion air being basically just blown in from a fan. And then we have our syngas that's coming in from let me show you back here. So the syngas comes out of here. So if you imagine that the shells are in here, they're cooking, and then the syngas is coming off, and the syngas is going to come out of here and flow into a cyclone, which do I have? Flows into this cyclone here, and then it flows right back into our system. So the cyclone removes dust and particulates as much as we can before we put it into these burners, because these burners tend to get clogged. And so we're trying to do as much as possible to prevent these from getting clogged, because when they get clogged, we have to shut down the whole process, and it takes a whole day to cool down. Then we have to take this apart by hand, clean it out, put it back together, and then it takes another half a day to get started. So we're talking 2 days of downtime when they get clogged. And so a lot of everything that you see is also about how do we prevent this from getting clogged, and it comes down to SOPs and maintenance and keeping the syngas at the right temperature. So you'll see that it's insulated here, and that's all to try to keep that syngas super hot, because we don't want that tar and the syngas to condensate, and then it'll stick to the dust, and then that's what really causes it to clog up. This is the burn chamber here. So anytime we have too much syngas, we need to flare it, and we flare it in a sealed burn chamber. So this just makes sure that all of the NOx is removed before we vent it out to the atmosphere. And this is essentially all of our abatements for ensuring that the final exhaust is at the right, essentially meets our permit requirements. We have like a bag house, denitrification, yada yada. This is just a heat exchanger, cools it down before we send it out through the bag house. And what you won't see in here, because we don't have it yet, is an ORC. And so the ORC will actually sit in between here. So this is where basically thermal oxidization is happening here. And then there's quite a bit of heat that's coming off there, like 1,000+ degrees, and we're going to add an ORC in here, and that ORC is going to capture that waste heat and start to generate electricity. Our electricity costs are around $40,000 to $50,000 a month, and so that ORC should be able to mostly take care of that. It won't. It maybe will generate a little bit extra, but it's not going to be a main component of our what we sell. So that's Carbon Zero. When Lindsey originally asked me to come and speak, it was on this topic of productization versus commodity. And so I want to talk a little bit about that and sort of where we landed on that. And I think the first thing to really say is that when we got into this, it was to sell carbon credits, not to sell biochar. And so we have optimized our process for the generation of carbon credits and not biochar. But with that said, if we don't sell the biochar, then the business model is really weakened. I mean, I wouldn't say it doesn't work, but it doesn't work as well as we want it to. And so it's really important that we have a market to be able to sell the biochar. And so when I think about productization versus commodity, one of the things I think about is like, how homogeneous is my product going to be? And I think that that's a lot of what, for us, we're targeting farmers, and if a farmer's putting it down on their fields, they want to know what they're buying is consistent, and they want to know it matches the specs, and they want to know that they can trust it. And so one of the problems that I've seen with non-homogeneous feedstock, so feedstock that's coming from, say, like storm debris or construction debris, is that it's not homogeneous. And so what are you selling? It, like, well, it depends on the time of year. It depends on where what trees were being cleared out at that time. And like what are your heavy metals? So your heavy metals are going to be completely dependent on, what your feedstock is. And if your feedstock's changing week by week, then your heavy metal profile is changing week by week. And that's going to make it very difficult to go out and sell a product that people can say, like, I know what this is, because they won't know what it is because you don't know what it is. And so that's sort of like the first question. And that probably matters a lot less if you're making like wood pellets versus if you're making a soil amendment. And I have to say, like, I don't know anything about the like wood pellet business or the firewood business or any of those businesses. I only know about biochar because that's what we've been doing for the last 2 years. And so all my comments are really, really dialed into that. But for biochar, for soil amendments, really want to take some time to think about like your feedstock and having a consistent process and making sure that your first super sack and your millionth super sack is going to be consistent. And so if you can do that, then I think that there's a real good opportunity for having a product with a brand, or working with some of these companies that have those outlets into Home Depot to sell your products there. And that kind of brings it into the next question is like, does the market exist? And what we found is that there wasn't a market for biochar. When we started looking into the space in 2024, from all basically from the outside, it looks like there is a thriving biochar market that sells almost like you could almost just sell it in a commodity market for $600 a ton, and it looks great. But the reality is when you actually get on the ground and try to sell it, like, there's not a market for it. There's nobody out there saying, "Hey, we want to buy biochar." So you actually have to go out and you have to sell it. You have to find buyers. You have to educate them, and you have to convince them that this is a product that they are missing out on. And that's been incredibly difficult, and it's been so difficult that we have actually we don't want to store the biochar on site. We just made a decision, like, we don't want to stockpile large amounts of biochar on site. It's there's $50 million of almond product that's also stored in the same property as us, and so storing a super flammable biochar product on site just doesn't make sense economically. And so we have to move it out. So if we don't have a buyer for it, we have to basically figure out a way to get it out. And so we're building that market. And I can say, like, there's programs like 336 and CDFA, and those have a lot of potential. So like CDFA has a new healthy soils program that's coming out. It's going to reimburse 200 or 250 per ton of biochar. 336 has a like $600 or $700 ton per acre that they'll reimburse. But to my knowledge, that hasn't rolled out at all in California. Like, no, haven't heard of a single California farmer who has received these subsidies yet from the NRCS. And the CDFA is not coming out till the end of the year. I'm a little bit more hopeful that the CDFA will actually result in some growers receiving these benefits. But to date to now, I haven't seen any of those benefits in California. I have seen it in Arkansas, and we have actually sold a little bit of biochar to Arkansas, to growers in Arkansas, because there's now a shortage of biochar in Arkansas because part by the 336 program is coming online in Arkansas. And so that's it. It leaves me very optimistic because if it's going to happen in Arkansas, I think it'll happen here. I think it's just taking a little bit longer to come online. And like, what we have is sort of a hybrid approach. And the reason, like I mentioned earlier, is like, we don't want to stockpile biochar on site because we don't feel like we can do that safely, and there's just too much of a fire risk. And so we sort of prioritize productization, and that means like being able to go out and sell directly to farmers and work with them with these 336 and CDFA grants to try to make it so it's not a cost to them. And that means being able to sell them a consistent and product that they can understand. But we also move what we can't, sort of I guess you might call it a commodity. And what that really means is we give it away to composters, because for composters, there's a benefit of it speeds up their yield by 20%. So it increases the aeration, which increases the amount of throughput that they can uh, move essentially their product through their life cycle. And so any extra biochar we aren't able to sell, we end up basically giving it away to these composters. And that's kind of the reality of the industry right now, is if you're dependent on being able to sell every single pound of biochar in your business model, like that's something that it should be a red flag for you, because it's not there yet. But I think when we see NRCS 336 come online, I think we might get to a better reality where biochar is a product that will just sort of move, because farmers want to take advantage of the free programs. Um, so then I wanted to touch a little bit on some of the hard lessons that we've learned. So I think it will be useful for anybody else that's coming and running the gauntlet that we've ran through. So first one is fire suppression is incredibly expensive, way more expensive than we originally anticipated. Um, they we thought we were going to be out in the well, we didn't think, we knew we'd be out in the middle of an almond field, and we thought that we would be sort of able to side skirt some of the fire suppression stuff that you would normally see in NFPA. But the reality is that it's really dependent on each fire department. Each fire department is different, and some fire departments are very risk adverse. And we had a very risk adverse fire department. So the fire department that we are working with, they have outsourced everything to a third party consultant in the Bay Area. And that Bay Area consultant basically treats us like we're a hospital in the middle of a metropolitan area. And so we have a highly sophisticated fire suppression system now that has backup, and it's diesel powered, and there could be a natural disaster and we will still have our fire sprinkler system in place and it will still work. And it was incredibly expensive. We were originally anticipating it would be less than $100,000 to do all of our fire suppression for our 70 by 90 foot building, and it ended up being about $500,000 when we were all said and done. And all that is water storage, sprinklers, alarms, and diesel powered fire pumps. So that's the first one, is like, make sure when you're doing your CapEx cost, like you understand exactly what is going to be required from your fire department for your specific jurisdiction, because it's going to be highly dependent on how risk adverse your fire department is. And in California, they can absolutely throw the book at you. I mean, just to give you one example, they almost made us pave a road to get to our site. And if they would have done that, it would have cost us $1.5 million. And we had to bring out geotech engineers to prove that the road could handle a fire truck with the base rock that we'd placed down on it. And even then it was still almost didn't go through. And then that would have sank the project. And so like you have to be careful about these pitfalls. And um so 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 keep that in mind. Like you gotta have a good relationship with your fire department, and you gotta understand, like, from day one, like what the project requirements are going to be for them, and don't assume that it's going to be the same in one county versus another county, or one city versus another city. Importing equipment. So we imported all of our equipment from China, and that is incredibly difficult, and it was way more challenging than we thought it was going to be. And the reason is that all of the standards for equipment in the US for NFPA, it's like UL listings, and can't remember what the other ratings are for like electrical boxes and things like that. But we weren't planning on it being so difficult. A lot of the equipment that we bought, we had to get rid of. We had to throw it away because it did not meet the US standards, and we couldn't prove and we couldn't prove that it meet the NFPA standards and NEMA requirements for fire protection, for like the hazard classification zones. And so we lots of waste there. And so you have to be incredibly diligent when you're ordering your equipment from China, or if you're importing it from another country, to make sure that it's up to going to be up to the code for the US. Another hard lesson is that everything's a fire risk. I can't count. Like 4 times I've been out to deal with fires on our site because of just our almond shells. And one time it happened during Thanksgiving, and we were all on Thanksgiving break, and the pile just decided that it was going to start to catch fire. And if a pile of shell catches fire, especially if it's in a county like Yolo County, which is where we had this pile stored, it can cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars in air permit fines. And so you need to be really, really cognizant that if you're going to be stockpiling any kind of biomass, it can catch fire, and it probably will catch fire if you're not managing it. Logistics always cost more than you think and are usually unreliable. Like that was a big surprise for me, is that you can go out and get a quote for logistics and they'll say, okay, we'll be $145 per truckload to get it from A to B. But as soon as that driver has a better deal, he's gone. And so we've had to deal with that a lot consistently. Well, they'll quote us a cost, but then completely unreliable, because as soon as somebody else says, hey, I'll pay you $200, they they go. So you have to get that in place. You have to get contracts in place with the drivers that guarantee both parties are going to be satisfied, and don't just assume that a handshake deal is going to guarantee that you're going to be able to move your feedstock or be able to move your biochar. We signed our feedstock off takes 2 years too soon. So we have spent about $1 million in almond shell that we haven't been able to use, that's now been gone to compost. We totally underestimated what it would take to be able to get the operation online. So in 2024, we signed the deal, and now we are going into 2026, and we still, we're basically going online now, but that's 2 years of harvest, 2 years of almond shell harvest that we've bought now that we haven't been able to utilize. And it, like I said before, it's a double whammy, because when you have this shell and you can't use it, then you have to pay to now drive it off of the property, like to drive it to be composted. You have to pay composters, or worst case is that you have to pay farmers to spread it on their fields, because it's got to go somewhere. It can't just stay, because it will catch fire. So we signed our offtakes too soon, and I would advise to be very careful about not signing your feedstock offtakes too soon. And then everything costs more and takes 3 times longer than you think. So it's about 30% margin on everything. Like any of your capex costs, assume it's going to be 30% more, and assume everything's going to take 3 times longer than you think it's going to be, because that's the reality, is it will take 3 times longer, and it is going to be about 30% more expensive. And I don't know why that's a reality. I don't know, like, what, there's like a law in the universe or what, but like, even if I was to try to account for that law, I feel like the universe is still going to make it take longer and 30% more. So just plan on things being more expensive, and you'll do well. Like, don't if you're raising money, if you're getting investors and you're raising money or getting debt, don't raise too little. Like, assume that it's going to cost more. Closing advice, hire industrial expertise from day one and focus on operational hires. I've seen this now like multiple times, where companies in this sector have raised some money and then they've gone out and hired a bunch of climate scientists. And then within 6 months, they're out of business because they have basically run out of capital. Every hire we've made has been focused on industrial and operations. And I'm really, really grateful that we've done it that way, because it's really paid off. That kind of next kind of follow up on that is do as much as you can in house. Anytime you do something out, like hire an electrical engineer out of house or whatever it is, it's going to cost you a lot, like double, at least double than doing it in house, assuming that you have the right in-house expertise. And so, like, we had that right in-house expertise to be able to do like electrical work ourselves, to be able to do a lot of the plumbing ourselves. We did outsource like the concrete and the foundation, but we also, like, we built the building ourselves, because we had that, we had a licensed California contractor on the payroll. And so all of these things ended up saving us a lot of money. Raising capital requires stacking incentives. It's really difficult to raise money in this space. And when investors are looking at putting money into projects like this, they want to see that there's stacked incentives. And what that means is that for every dollar that they put in, they want to see 30 cents to 50 cents of additional value. So that could be like 45 credits, tax credits that are going to come in after the project to for, like, I think it's like 30% of the project cost. So things like that, that's what makes it attractive to investors. And so what you really want to do is, when you go talk to an investor, you want to say, like, look, we've got 45E tax credits. We've got a grant from, let's say it could be from like the California fire. We have all of these things in place. And so every dollar you invest into us is going to go so much further than if you were to invest it somewhere else. That's the only way I've seen projects in this space get financed is they've been highly, there's been incentives like highly stacked in their favor. So it's grants, federal grants, local grants, city grants, um, federally backed guarantees. Like you need all of this in place. You need everything. Like you need to shake every tree to find every incentive. Get 3 quotes for everything and know that people have no problem adding 300% margin to materials. I've seen this now multiple times where, and it's interesting because I didn't know what things cost when I started this project, but now I kind of have an idea. And so like I've seen quotes come in where they're saying it's going to cost $160,000. And I say like, there's no way this is going to cost $160,000. We bought the same pipe 4 months ago and it was $50,000. And sure enough, like, they say like, oh yeah, we can get the price down, but they assume that you don't know what it's going to cost. And if like, I will just say this, like do as much as you can in-house, but if you don't know what things cost, you might as well go get a general contractor because people are going to take advantage of you and you're going to end up paying more. So make sure if you're going to do it in-house that you know what things cost and get 3 quotes for everything. So and then finally be sure to have fun and love the work, because if you don't have fun and love the work, you're going to hate it, because this is really hard. And like when you're dealing with fires on Thanksgiving, like I am really grateful that I actually love this, because if I didn't love this and I was dealing with a pile of almond shell catching fire while I'm in Washington visiting my parents on Thanksgiving and having to deal with that, like you gotta love this work. And I can tell you it's a lot of fun. And so I'm not trying to discourage anybody. It's actually one of the funnest things I've ever done in my life, but it is like incredibly hard. And so just make sure that you have fun and love the work. And that's it for this. And my contact info is here. So if anybody wants to reach out, happy to help any way I can, and open to any questions from the audience as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Greg, for sharing. And I think the first question that I had written down for you is about the equipment, and you may have hit a little bit about this, but maybe share a little bit more. It was around if you designed your own equipment or did you buy stock items?
Yeah, so all of our equipment came OEM from China. It was from a manufacturer called Beston. So this equipment that you see here is actually the VST 50S model, and it was about $1.2 million when we purchased it.
Great, thank you. The question we have right now is, could you describe your capital stack at a high level, grants versus self-funded versus debt versus equity, the total capital required to get live?
Yeah, so we've spent about $5.2 million to date. And like I mentioned, that there were some mistakes that were made, like buying feedstock too soon. So not all of that money has gone into the capital expenditure. I'd say about probably 3.8 or 3.9 is probably of that would be allocated to capital expenditure. Um, like I said, the equipment was like 1.2, and then maybe the other 2 million was in the building, the concrete, the electrical, the water, and then fire suppression. Um, and then in terms of like, we went a little bit of a different route for financing our setup. We actually, me and my business partner, we just funded it ourselves. But that's that's not always an option. If that's not an option, like I have actually seen other folks finance these things, and the way they did it is through the stacking incentives. And so it's yeah.
So we'll just come to you guys when we want to start a project so you guys can find additional ones. No, how did you decide on your volume of operation is the next question for you.
We just went with the largest OEM piece of equipment that we could get. So we originally thought about doing a smaller volume throughput and doing like a pilot scale up. But what we realized really early on is that the cost to build the facility is only about 30% of the equipment, and then the other 70% is in the build out around it. And the build out around it actually doesn't get much cheaper if you go smaller volume. So we could spend $3 million on the build out and 1.2 or $2 million, $2.5 million on the build out and 1.2 on that, and or we could spend $2.5 million on the build out and spend $500,000 in that. But if we're going to be spending all that on the build out anyway, like it just made more sense to go with the most volume throughput that we could.
Great, thank you. Um, and I don't know if your site has ability to generate energy, but the next question was if you have or are you thinking about getting a power purchase agreement with PG&E or I guess with CCA or another entity like.
Yeah, we've looked into that a little bit. Interconnects are really hard to come by right now. And so there's two substations that are within proximity to us, and they're both overutilized at the moment. So the cost to actually get an interconnect is quite expensive. So we haven't really gone down that path. I know I've had meetings with folks that are like all they do is like the biomat programs. So my understanding is that like that's getting harder and harder to do. Like PG&E is sort of made it very challenging for new folks to come online with the biomat programs, and that really only leaves CCAs. But like I said, without that interconnected, it's not really feasible to even sell it to a CCA. So we are going to be generating some electricity, and what right now we're looking to generate enough electricity to cover our $50,000 a month electrical bill, and then we might have a little bit extra that we will feed back to the almond processor that's on the same premises.
Great. Actually, Kathy had one more, so I'll before I jump in, I'll ask her question, which was, can you develop a partner with a or have you looked into doing a battery storage facility?
Not yet. No, that's hasn't we haven't had a chance to look into that yet, but that's interesting.
Okay, great. And actually, I just had one question, and then maybe unless there's another one that pops up, we can wrap it up. But yeah, it sounds like the selling the power to your almond shell partner is a benefit of being co-located. And I'm guessing like reduced costs in transportation. But do you mind just sharing a few of the benefits and maybe some of the negatives of being co-located?
Sure. Benefits, like you said, the logistics are so important. I've seen, let me just say this. You can fix a mechanical issue. And so if you buy some equipment and there's a mechanical issue or a process issue, like that's easy to fix. A business, a business issue is much harder to fix. So if your business model has a hole in it and you pick the wrong location, you can't fix that. You can't bring in a mechanic and fix that. Like you've locked into this location and you're stuck with it. And so you really, really need to understand your business model when you pick a location, and picking a location that's near your feedstock is going to make or break you. And then if you're doing biochar like we are, and you need to mix it with compost in order to collect the carbon credits, being close to the compost is also going to make and break your business. Logistics can really quickly end up being the vast majority of your cost if you're not really, really diligent when you're picking your site location. And so we chose to co-locate because we realized one really critical thing, which is the volume reduction during pyrolysis is about 70%. So of all the material that goes in, about 1/3 of it will come out the other end. And so we have the choice where we can transport biochar or we can transport feedstock. And if we're going to be transporting it either way, we want to transport the littlest amount as possible. So we can either transport 3 times the almond shell, or we can transport 1/3 of the biochar. And that's the main reason why we chose to co-locate. And it's also really good to partner with people who understand biomass. So perhaps you already have like this expertise in biomass handling. We didn't. And so partnering with somebody who had that biomass expertise was crucial. They taught me how to run a front loader. They showed us what happens, like how do you handle an almond shell fire? Like I had no idea how to handle it. Like you whatever you do, you don't spray water on it. That would have been my first instinct, is like, well, let's spray water on it, but that's actually makes it a lot worse. And so you kind of have to dig it out, and there's a whole process around how to handle it. And so partnering with somebody who's has 10-20 years of experience, like a company that has 10-20 years of experience that's survived in material handling for 20 years, is gonna potentially make or break your business. And so that's all the benefits. The sort of cons of it is that, like I mentioned before, there's $50 million of almond on their property during harvest, and that makes everybody extremely nervous when we're out there. There's just a lot of risk. And so when we're talking about like, okay, well, there's gas, there's hazardous materials. Their next question is like, well, how do we mitigate the risk for our $50 million of almonds that are going to be stored there right next to you when harvest comes? And so we ended up having to buy a $50 million liability insurance to cover their entire essentially the entire harvest for Colusa County. We is insured against one of our policies. And that's incredibly expensive. And so like that's the con is that they're handling the risk.
Yep. Yep. Thank you for sharing.
Yep.
Appreciate it. And so I think, let's see, Mariel just said, so one approach is to ideal the, okay, thank you, Mariel. Well, thank you, Greg. Appreciate it. And thanks for sharing your information. If you don't mind, we'll put it in our recap that we send out. But again, sharing all the process and all the work and learnings that you've done building your facility is really valuable. And we have people from, just thinking about it to those that have done a project or two. And so love sharing. So really appreciate you kind of going through and running the gamut and answering all our questions. And I guess we'll wrap it up there with you, but thank you again so much. And now we'll kick it over to Neal, who will kind of go in the nitty-gritty of how productization, deciding commodity versus a branded item, how you could run through that kind of decision tree making, and then a little bit more about what that actually look like as a product moving forward after you make the decision going through commodity or branded item and the process along with those. So thanks, Neal, and take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Lindsey. For those that weren't on the first webinar, my name is Neal Gottlieb. I'm kind of a jack of all trades. I currently work as a fractional CFO for a number of companies in the energy biomass space, as well as branded products. My background before this was actually starting and growing an organic ice cream brand. So a lot of my experience is in the realm of brands, but from the finance side, I do a lot of work with companies that are selling commodities. So trying to present a balanced approach to the decision of, do I create a commodity and sell a commodity, which is, basically a good like oil or green coffee beans or orange juice futures that is just completely interchangeable with every other barrel of oil or gallon of orange juice concentrate sold on the commodity market? Or do I add value to that commodity that I'm processing and sell as a branded product, right? Rather than just no name orange juice in the grocery store. Do I sell as Tropicana? Do I make my own brand? Am I selling as Exxon gasoline rather than just crude oil and adding value that way? So I'll share my screen and we'll get right into the discussion. And Lindsey, thumbs up if you can see my screen. Great.
Yep.
So, choosing a commodity or a brand, or the question is, do both make sense? So our last session to do with concept development and project costing, there was some homework that was sent home. We're a little bit behind schedule, so I'm going to just skip through that. Hopefully everybody did take some time to reflect about the projects that they're working on and ask themselves the questions that were in the worksheet. So opening poll, which you can, there might be a poll pop up or it might be in the chat. When you think about the biomass project, there's the poll. When you think about the biomass project that you're working on, how do you envision it? What are the products that you see yourself selling? And are those products going to be commodities, or do you see yourself moving towards a branded product that potentially has higher margins, but also has higher costs? So when we're talking about commodity or branded, um, each one is a distinct path and each has its own sets of advantages and drawbacks. Since we're dealing with biomass, we're starting with commodities. The feedstock itself is a commodity that in most cases folks will have to buy, or if they have a source of it that they don't have to pay for it, they could potentially also sell it to someone else. Commodity business is because there's fewer steps. They're a faster way to get in business. They offer lower overhead because you're not paying, for example, for packaging machines or to have a graphic designer make packaging or to check regulatory language on a package and to potentially have your lawyer check on marketing claims. So there's just far fewer steps that you have to take. Um, in turn, they also have most often simpler operations. You're making that one thing or a few different things, selling it in bulk, just like every other version of that biomass product, whether that be a biofuel, a mulch, biochar, however those are sold. It's just being sold in bulk. You're cleaning your hands and you're making more. Keeping operations much simpler, potentially allowing for much leaner staff than when you get into building out a sales and marketing organization. In turn, it means less capital required to get the business off the ground. And arguably, they're more predictable, but then you are also dependent upon the market price for whatever that commodity is that you're selling. If you're going further, adding value, branded products have the advantage that they offer a higher margin. So often, but not always, for smaller operations, branded products can make sense in that you're not competing against the much larger operations selling commodities that have economies of scale that are much more favorable than what you're selling. When you're selling branded product, you get to set the price. Doesn't necessarily mean that somebody will buy it, but you can, generally speaking, position your product in the market as maybe a mid-level product, a premium product, and that allows you to not be dependent solely on the going rate in the market, but then to also help position your product and therefore your margin at levels that make sense to you. With the branded product, you're also building up a customer base and assuming you're making a good product that people want to continue to support customer loyalty. So you're able to command those higher margins on a repeat basis, which can be a path towards financial viability for businesses. And then, of course, they're defensible because you're not just selling the same biochar or carbon credits or electricity that everyone else is selling. You're selling, a packaged good with your own branding that people end up becoming loyal customers to, and in turn, it becomes a defensible business in a way that moves you away from being dependent upon the commoditized market. There is more potential upside as you think about, selling a brand versus selling a commodity producer. But there's also a lot more costs that go into trying to get to that point of upside. So the question of, which is better really is very much dependent on the individual operation, and it can also change over time. A business can start simple operations, putting out biochar and carbon credits like Greg is doing. And then maybe in the future, Greg decides, we have the opportunity to sell a soil amendment branded in, smaller bags to Home Depot and Lowe's. So we're going to invest in a packaging line and move into selling a branded product as well. But then, there's benefits for each, and then there's also trade-offs. Commodities, you don't get to set the price. I think Greg's example of having to actually give away a good percentage of his biochar is a great example of that. The market simply isn't there. If he decides to go the route of the example of packaging up and selling on the consumer side, maybe there is market. But currently, there's serious volume constraints with his business. Thin margins, at least on the biochar side. Carbon credits are, of course, a different product. Thin margins, since you're not setting the price, the market moves closer and closer towards, if we think back to Econ 101, for those of us that took it, towards perfect competition, where there's uh, thin margins, little profit to be had because of many players offering the exact same product. Often, also commodities are highly dependent upon one buyer. You make your biochar, you sell it all to one off-taker, and if they decide to cancel the contract, they run into financial challenges of their own. They get a better deal. All of a sudden, you don't have an off-taker for that. And then, thinking about building long-term value in a business, commodities don't have really any sort of long-term equity that's built because your business is entirely built upon, let's say, your cash flows and the equipment that you have in the business, not like a Coca-Cola on the brand esteem and the promise that that brand will continue to bring in revenue year after year after year. Um, and of course, when you're selling commodities and you're offloading all of your product to one commodified stream, it can be hard to break through and set aside the volume to then move into branded products if that's a desire that one wishes to go. On the branded side, they can be much slower to build revenue just because you don't necessarily have big offtake contracts that allow you to fill up your capacity, run your operation at full efficiency. Like mentioned earlier, they have those higher upfront costs, and they have a lot more execution risk because you're not just producing the thing, then you're taking all of the other steps needed to reach the end consumer, which is often a retail consumer, whether that be online, through a chain like a Home Depot, a garden center, so on and so forth, for, giving the example of like a biochar or soil amendment. They definitely add huge amounts of complexity to operations from the thousand little steps that you have to take in order to get that product to market, make it compliant, and ultimately get folks to agree to sell the product or to sell direct to consumers. And there's takes a whole bunch of different skills that you don't necessarily have. It's not to say that selling biochar at Home Depot would be rocket science, but the whole sales and marketing side of the business is very different from the operational side of actually just producing the product. Um, so, looking at the different paths, the obvious reason that people move towards branded products is that promise or that opportunity to get higher revenue, but it doesn't necessarily result in higher profits. So it's really important to kind of look at the opportunity in front of you and what your business can do. If we're talking about an example of mulch, just selling bulk by the truckload, you know, you're probably looking at about $20 to $40 per cubic yard to the buyer. It probably doesn't matter if it's yours or any of the other thousand, mulch producers on the West Coast. It ends up coming down to cost and to price. But if you're able to add value by putting it in bags, selling it at a size that is approachable to, the home consumer, wants to just spread a little bit in their garden or in their front yard, make some promises about how it's, from a sustainable source and you treat your workers well and whatnot. Suddenly you can be looking at, potentially increasing the price per cubic yard, 3 or 4 times. But that, of course, does come with costs and complexities. So those are all important considerations as you go forth and get tempted by the high margins of branded goods. It's important to not forget the path that it takes to get there. So going more into detail, we'll look at commodity versus branded products, what defines a brand. My background when I was a wee little college kid, I worked at a branding agency in New York City. and they had a really great framework for defining a brand, which I think is very valuable to get into. Looking at productizing biomass. With that, it's important to look at pricing and go to market to make sure that there's a realistic path towards improved profitability, and then building the brand and next steps. So, as touched upon, they're really two fundamentally different products. A branded product basically picks up where a commoditized product um, stops. Commoditized products are fungible. They're completely interchangeable. Your biochar, Greg's biochar, the 100 other biochar producers in Northern California are offering the exact same thing. So you don't have the power to set the price. You're one player out of many, and it ends up being the market setting the price. The way that you win is by being the lowest cost producer. And if anyone hears screeching in the background, that's my wife just got home from a few days away, and the dog is absolutely losing itself. It's not getting harmed. It's just excited to see its owner. Um, the way that you win in this market is assuming that, we're talking about everything on the same spec, is by being the lowest cost producer. That's it. It doesn't matter, how well you treat your employees, the source of the product. If it's just going on a commoditized market, it comes down to cost. And that ends up often, but not always, creating challenges for smaller producers because you don't have the economies of scale to compete with larger operations. Um, but as Greg also touched upon in what he said, transportation ends up being an enormous factor in um, in the final cost. So there's many examples where you could be a small operation that doesn't have the greatest economies of scale, but because of your location, you can end up serving an appropriate customer base, filling up your capacity, and running a profitable business. On the customer side, commodities are generally speaking transactional. Greg also gave examples kind of going around and building relationships. Um, there's examples of both. It depends, if you're able to sell like on a spot market, um, or if you're going to have to be the one to go out and sell the goods to individuals and businesses yourself. Um, and two biomass examples would just be, wood chips or hog fuel um, sold to an energy producer. They don't really care about, your story or where the product came from, as long as you're getting it to them at the spec and at the right price. Whereas branded products are differentiated. Every little detail you put on a brand, from the name to how you package it up to certifications to the package design, those are all differentiators that build the brand and allow you to set yourself apart from all the other brands of that same sort of product that are on the market. You get to set the price. Of course, that doesn't mean that the consumer is willing to pay that. So it ends up being a balance of finding a price that customers are willing to pay, that can also make up for the fact that you are going to put more costs into your product by packaging it up, by getting certifications and such. How you win isn't just a matter of finding, that one or two large off-takers and selling at the market rate. It ends up being a matter of sales relationships, getting into different outlets, reaching consumers directly, and finding means to justify the premium pricing and make it work when you factor in your sales expenses, your delivery expenses, and such. The relationships, as a result, end up being relational, and can be long term. I know the guy that sells mangoes to Trader Joe's, which is actually a, generally speaking, commoditized product. He sold mango to Trader Joe's for like dried mango for like 30 years. Not because his are any better, but because of the relationship. And as a result, he's done very well for himself. Some examples in biomass would be, consumer friendly size bags of Soil amendment sold under a brand with a nice certification to it, attractive packaging, that's sold at Home Depot or Lowe's. So, the commodity question, so many biomass projects do default to selling the raw output, and there's a reason for it. It's often the easier, safer, and obtainable path for businesses to take. It's how you're buying feedstock, and often the products that you're making or the scale of, say, the biochar that you're producing or whatever the output is, it simply makes sense to find one or more off-takers, have contracts, and be done with it. Just have that sustainable business where you know that you can make the product, the commodity, at a price that you can be profitable on the open market at the market price. Um, and that can be a really great business. It can be simple, it can be sustainable, and it can be attractive because of all the other benefits that we spoke about earlier. Lower startup costs, faster to market, easier operations. Those are all real reasons to consider um, a commodity business. Um, but I think, one really important question to ask is, does your cost structure make sense? It's tempting to think, I'm going to go the simplified route and sell a commodity. But you definitely have to make sure that your cost structure is in line. I was working with a firewood business in Southern California that decided they were going to build a pellet mill and sell pellets for the home heating market in Southern California. But when we actually, got into the process and took a deep dive into costing, as I did in my fractional CFO role for them, and an ugly truth came out, which is that they couldn't produce these pellets less expensively than they could actually just buy them on the wholesale market, on the commodity market. It just um, ended up making no sense for them to invest the roughly $10 million that it would take to bring that project to life because their cost structure, because of their location in a resort town in Southern California, where labor rates were really high, where fuel prices were really high, where the feedstock wasn't necessarily closely located, it really just made a really kind of ugly picture for their costs, and they absolutely could not sell the commoditized products that they were thinking of. They then explored branded products, ended up deciding it just made sense to buy chips, buy pellets, and put their name on it. But it's super important to get an honest picture of what your costs are going to be. And with that, understanding what the delivered price is for consumers, because that can make or break a business. If you're, um, in the case of Greg's supplier selling shells, he's co-located with them. They have a supply contract. That business makes sense because the biomass is right there, and they're now getting paid for a product that they previously had to pay to dispose of. If Greg had located 50 miles away, it probably wouldn't have made sense because it would be 100 miles round trip for a truck to get there. So when evaluating your businesses, be sure to factor in every cost with and as honest a picture as you can have for transportation costs, for energy costs, as well as estimates for how those are going to change in the future. Because if something is operating on a lean margin today, you have to ask yourself, well, what happens if energy prices increase 20% as they tend to do in the state of California over, unfortunately, short periods of time, and make sure that you're setting yourself up for success with a commodified business. Um, with biomass, we can frame it as a ladder of the raw feedstock. In Greg's example, buying walnut shells, often it's woody biomass from forests or rice hulls and such in Northern California. Um, then that feedstock can be converted and have value added to become a bulk commodified unbranded product like biochar. More value can then be added as a packaged product. For in case of biochar, it might be a difference of selling it in super sacks or by the truckload to consumer bags that are sold more or less on a commodified business but packaged up. And then you can establish the demand for more value by going deeper with the branding, getting certifications, showing that what you say is in the bag is in the bag. There's no heavy metals. It's treating your workers well, so on and so forth. Each step of that ladder, you're adding more value, and as a result, you're able to command higher prices per ton. Um, so I think another important message with deciding should your product be a commodity, should it be a branded, is you can do both. A mix of the two can be a really great way to help fill up your capacity. Um, if you're pursuing a branded product, but you're not necessarily going to fill your capacity in year one or year two or year three, you can sell the rest of your capacity as commodities in the meantime to help fill up your plant capacity, lower your overhead and labor per unit, and help ensure a steady cash flow while you convert over towards filling capacity with your branded products at a higher margin. Um, and think about the economics of running factory, every hour that the production line is turned off, it's missed opportunity. And as a result, it can be costly. So, as you're considering going forward with a biomass business, I would definitely encourage folks to think about how can you do both in order to fill capacity, help out cash flow, and lower your overhead per unit, which then allows you to offer your branded products at more approachable pricing. So getting into the Landor view on branding, and you think about what you're going to put out into the world, there's kind of four pillars that brands are built on: differentiation, relevance, esteem, and knowledge. Differentiation is often heralded as this great aspect of brands, but it's important to remember that it has to be relevant. When I had my ice cream business, I could have done sardine ice cream. It would have been highly differentiated from anything else on the market, but it wouldn't have been relevant and it wouldn't have been held in high esteem. So when you're thinking about your brand, it's that balance of how do I make something that's slightly differentiated? It might just be a matter of, calling it Neal's biochar, making it relevant. That can be a matter of place. That can be a matter of pricing that makes sense, making it in a package that works for your end consumer, such as a 10-pound bag sold at a Home Depot. And then how do I build esteem? So if people are choosing my biochar rather than Greg's, right? I can highlight, how it's certified. It doesn't have any heavy metals. We leave the dust out, so on and so forth. All those different things that can help build esteem. I think the consumer company that I always think of with esteem is Patagonia, because for 40 years they've done just a beautiful job of building up esteem around great products, treating workers fairly, using organic fabrics, so on and so forth. But then ultimately, none of it matters if people don't know about you. So then it's also a matter of like, how do you get the knowledge out so that people understand, what your brand is, how it's differentiated, why it's relevant, why they should love it. So those are the four branding pillars to think about. Um, and I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly so that we have time for the Q&A in the time. But In the case of feedstock, differentiation for a biomass product, where is the product from? Is the feedstock from clear cutting forests and kind of has a story that people don't want to know about, or is it biomass that comes as a byproduct of fire mitigation, which of course in California can be a highly desirable trait. Um, does it have a certification that shows that it's very, in fact, related to um, clearing forests for forest health, and so forth? What's the form that it's going to come in? So, in thinking about setting up a biomass plant, you know, do I want logs or do I want something that's already chipped, which means that I don't need to spend, say, $500,000 on a chipping system? So, how is it different, but also staying relevant? You don't want to get too crazy in the world of biochar and biomass. It's important to think about what the end consumer wants, whether that's the Home Depot or a farmer or some sort of industrial buyer. Home Depot selling to consumers is an easy example. Um, it has to be in a size, a format that is approachable for consumers, like a 10-pound bag, a 30-pound bag, not trying to sell to consumers in super sacks that they wouldn't have any way to handle. Esteem and knowledge. Um, if you're talking about a commoditized brand, you're just selling on price. But if you're talking about, a branded product, there can be a lot to bundle in with a product in order to build trust with consumers. Because ultimately, especially when we think about biomass products, consumers are going to want to know, in the case of pellet, is it going to burn well in my stove and not clog it up? If it's something they're putting in their garden, is it going to be, chemical free, and be an amendment that I feel good about growing food in to feed my family, so on and so forth. And then knowledge, in this day and age of social media, um, it's one of the hardest things and one of the easiest things to do at the same time because there's so much noise out there. But getting your name out there, educating folks about what you're doing and why. So, like in the case of forest health, there's a lot of stories to be told about helping to improve forest health, helping to reduce wildfire risk in California. Those sorts of stories can be really meaningful and help people to gravitate towards supporting you and your business. So, um, I think this might pop up as well as a poll is, think about if you're considering a brand, how you're going to score on the direct framework. How is your product going to be differentiated, yet still remain relevant to your end consumer? How are you going to build up esteem, give people reason to support you and your business? And ultimately, how are you going to get people to find out about you so that they can support you? This is going to be in the chat, to differentiate um, or commoditize. What are you thinking with your business? We'd love to know. And how are you going to set your business apart? Jeff Grief, who is on this chat, he's building out a wood fiber business for horticulture. He's done a really great job of communicating just exactly why his business is going to make a lot of sense by differentiating from other woody biomass products on the market and the current alternative for horticulture, which is peat moss, that has a very negative environmental story. So if you could take some time in your worksheet to think about that, that would be great. And then moving into productizing, it seems like there's just huge possibilities when we think about biomass and what the end result can be. They have um, very different cost profiles. The one thing I would encourage people to think about is um, Greg is a great example of that, of are there multiple revenue streams that you can generate from the biomass that you're bringing into your facilities with the equipment that you have? So his facility, obviously on the physical side, it can only produce biochar, but they also get carbon credits. That's the core of the business. They're not selling all their biochar, but they're getting carbon credits for every ton produced. And they're considering is there an opportunity in the future to sell either electricity or heat? So these having multiple revenue streams, if possible, especially often I would say bundling in carbon credits or incentives for helping with forest health and such can be really meaningful and can be a huge difference between a project being unsustainable financially or potentially being long-term profitable, sustainable business. So definitely think about that, whether you're pursuing something that's commodified or branded. Um, huge, huge aspect of products as we think about them as consumers ends up being the packaging. Case of the biochar example that we'll keep on using, um, Greg can sell truckloads to farmers. Hopefully, he'll have that opportunity soon. But currently, he can't do anything as far as reaching consumers who might want small amounts for their backyard garden, because he doesn't have that capacity to bag up. So, um, having the ability to put in different formats, can be a really important deciding factor for defining the product and differentiating. When you have packaging, of course, you end up having a lot of real estate that allows you to tell your story, define the product, offer certifications, your origin stories, how you're helping with forest health, um, so on and so forth, so that you know the story gets across. You get to differentiate yourself further. You have an opportunity to build esteem and also make yourself more relevant. And then form, of course, affects function and price. You might be tempted to put, biochar into nice glass jars, but those are going to be expensive versus, a very inexpensive plastic bag for, just displaying pallets at Home Depot instead of a boutique biochar brand on the shelves of Home Depot, which nobody would want because it'd be too expensive. So as you're thinking about, moving further down the line from commoditized products to branded, it's important to, A, factor in what the packaging is going to be that you're going to offer it in, because that will help to dictate whom you can actually sell to, but also think about the cost that will go into that. And it's not just a question of the marginal cost of the plastic bag, it's also a matter of, well, what's the process and the cost, which might be labor, it might be machines, in order to get that product into a bag or into bales or however it's going to ultimately be sold, and make sure that those costs are factored into your final cost accounting in order to determine your price. Um, One thing that we see a lot of, and probably more and more on biomass products, would just be different certifications. Friends of mine have a topsoil business, so now they're selling organic topsoil at Home Depot, which 5 years ago, I don't know that that even existed as a category. But because they're the first national brand of organic topsoil at Home Depot, they're getting a lot of media about it. They're getting a lot of social media about it. They're getting good placements from Home Depot because the buyers know and store merchandisers know that that can really help to build esteem for their brand. So as you think about what retail packaging you're going to put out into the world, I encourage folks to think about, well, what are the certifications or badges that I can have on my package in order to ultimately help communicate to the consumer what you're selling, why it's the product that they want, and to ultimately demand something of a higher price than you would get as a commodified product. And finally, pricing margin and go to market. This is an example of theoretical of, say, biochar, how much we could get at different in different forms. So bulk commodity, I know um, Greg mentioned something about $600 a pound. I had the example of $250 a pound in here, which might be at a 28 margin. So super lean. That doesn't leave margin for lots of sales or marketing, but you're going to fill up trucks, move them to your off-taker, and be done. A packaged product could sell for $450 a ton, in, let's say, in 50-pound bags. That gives you a somewhat higher, significantly high margin of 47%. And suddenly that's in the territory where you can spend, say, 10 to 15% on sales, maybe 10% on marketing, and still have a healthy profit margin to help cover your overhead and, of course, hopefully bring about profits at the end of the day. Um, and then if we think about something that's, branded and certified, like certified organic biochar is probably not a product, but you might be able to eke out another, say, 7 margin points, which can ultimately be a very significant difference on the bottom line. Um, so as we think about branded products and getting them into the world, the big question is, how are you going to reach the consumers? This obviously has a lot of overlap with commodified products as well. But with branded products, the um, opportunities are going to come most likely, with a broader array of off-takers in the form of retailers and such. So there's direct and business to business. In the case of biomass products like soil amendments, biochar, because transportation costs are such a big factor, reaching out to growers in your immediate area might very well be the way to go because you have a significant price advantage over the biochar that's being shipped from potentially hundreds of miles away. Um, Retailers and garden centers, these are often direct relationships. If you're selling to Friedman's or Lowe's or Home Depot, you're going to sell directly to them, you're going to ship directly to them, and as a result, get healthy margins. If you're looking to, say, reach some of the many hundreds or thousands of independent garden centers on the West Coast, in all likelihood, you're going to go through a distributor because you can't reach the sloats of the world that are up in Washington and Oregon and Southern California with your distribution network. But your product can potentially go into a warehouse, onto a truck to reach the smaller, more independent players that are going to be buying through distributors. And then, of course, online and selling direct to buyers. So this is obviously highly variable, but wanted to put out some kind of ranges for, how much can it cost to actually build a brand? If you need to go about and have a logo designed and then labels designed, have a lawyer look them over, have to pay for printing plates and tooling in order to have bags printed. This can easily go into the tens of thousands of dollars, depending on how many different labels you're talking about, what the format is, and such. If you're looking at certifications, same idea. Each one is going to add more cost. Each one can also add more value to the finished product. but you're probably looking at, at least a few $1,000s for each certification. And of course, just generally speaking, more paperwork, more bandwidth that's going to get taken up with this sort of workload. Sales and marketing, that's probably on the low range. If you're thinking about hiring a salesperson in California, you're looking at least $100,000 most likely, if not significantly more. And that's probably going to end up being one of the biggest marginal expenses beyond the working capital needed to actually, buy the bags, pay to have the inventory in stock rather than just clearing it out immediately to a commodity broker. Um, so, if you're tempted to go forth with a branded product, there could certainly be a lot of opportunity. But in all likelihood, you're going to need, at least $100,000 bare minimum to even start to think about offering a branded product as opposed to um, just remaining strictly commoditized and selling to contracted off-takers or to the spot market through brokers. So then our last section, building the brands and next steps, just kind of looking at pathways for commodity sales and then pathways for branded sales. Some things that you can do now is start to think about whom you can sell to. There's no harm in picking up the phone, emailing, if you have folks in your local community, um, start talking with people about the potential of them becoming your off takers. But as we think about the process of confirming your specs, you know like Greg said, the biomass that he's buying for his operation with shells, he's run into a lot of problems by buying product and being contractually obliged to buy product that is off spec because those specs weren't set up in the beginning. Getting folks samples, negotiating prices, so on and so forth. So, you know, realistically speaking, assuming that you actually have product to sell, we could look at 4 to 8 months in order to get going with a commoditized product. Potentially even faster if your product is on spec. You have easy paths to find off takers, and you work quickly with contracts and such. So that can be a really fast path and relatively inexpensive. When you start thinking about a branded product, you have to do basically all of the steps of the commoditized product. But then you have to decide what exactly you're selling, get the packaging and designed, which I think 2 to 3 months I would consider kind of bare minimum to get packaging designed and printed. It can often be 4 to 6 months. Um, Start thinking about whom you're going to reach out to, how you're going to reach them, and then what the timing is to actually get into the sales channel. For a product like a soil amendment, Home Depot is probably going to make changes once or twice a year. They're not going to necessarily just put your product in when you're ready. So there can be very much a hurry up and wait, get the sales meeting, get in front of them. But they might only do their reset, say, in February of each year before the spring growing season. So realistically, the path to a branded product can be quite long, and you could be looking at a year or potentially even 2 years before your product is on the shelf and available to consumers. And that is us reaching the end. Some homework before the next webinar, which is focused on financing, which is to think about identifying 3 to 5 potential customers. Even if you're going the path of a commodified product, I think being able to diversify your off-takers can be really meaningful, especially if you're larger volume, so that something happens to one, you still have a revenue stream. If you're going the path of going with branded products, I encourage you to think about, what is your differentiation? How are you going to stand out to your buyer, whether that be somebody you're selling to in bulk or whether you're talking about selling to an end consumer in a small packaged good. And then also thinking about, I meant to say identify a lab, not to send samples, but if you're going to be getting certifications and such, you're probably going to have to get lab tested. So that can be homework that you do now, which is identify labs, find out how much it's going to cost to have samples run, and have that in your book of information. And then there are some resources as you think about different categories in which to operate in and different standards and certifications to work towards.
Great.
So
Thank you so much, Neal. Really appreciate it. We'll send out the slide deck and some other resources to you all shortly after this webinar. And just want to know that we are at time, so we have to leave. We understand, but we'll stay on. Neal, you can stay on for a few more minutes if
yep,
you still have any
I'm
questions.
available.
Okay, great. Yeah, so thank you all. But if there's any questions, please pop them in the chat and we'll stay on to talk more. I think we covered a lot today, a lot to think about. So thanks, Neal, and thanks everyone for joining us. Again, we'll post this webinar online and be sharing all the resources, plus into some additional items for you all next week. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.